Everybody, thank you for joining me for our statistics part 2, which is going to include kind of wrapping up our topics about bias and also talking about how to collect data. So first off, let me kind of review where you're at on statistics. So we introduced things by first saying, okay, so we need to identify a variable, and essentially we do that because we start with a question, something that you want to know. How many students check their cell phone in class? I don't know. So you start with a question, and after you ask that question, you identify a variable and a population. You recognize that you cannot ask every single person in that population. So you move to step 2, where you choose a sample size. Okay, so you take that population, you think, how can I represent that population correctly? And then you find a way to collect the data, which is really, this is what we're going to talk about. This is going to be a good chunk of today's focus. And then I just want to kind of reiterate one other thing related to sampling, which is the 5 types of sampling. Okay, so there's self-selected, okay, and if you think about what the word self-selected means, you're selecting to participate in the sample yourself. There is also surveying out of convenience. This would be like if we wanted to sample the entire high school, but we decided to only sample Algebra 2 students because we teach Algebra 2. That's straight up out of convenience. There's a systematic way to test where maybe you write a rule and then you pick every third person. There's a stratified type of sampling, all right? And then there's a cluster where you kind of put everybody in a group and then you identify one group. I want to point out that these last 2 are the most random of sampling, and that if you want to avoid any bias in your sample, because really the heart of statistics comes in these first 2 steps, in how you set up your sample and how you collect your data, okay? Those are the ways that you are going to get the best statistical analysis and you're going to get the most useful information. And so the key thing is, to decrease bias. So decrease with random sampling. So your bias, I should say, can decrease with random sampling. And as a reminder, bias is any error from misrepresenting the population. Okay, so to just kind of revisit those topics, let's look at a couple of examples. So we're going to identify the type of sample. So it's going to be one of those 5 things I just gave you. And we're going to explain why this situation we're looking at is biased. Okay, so the first situation, a news organization asks its viewers to participate in an online poll about bullying. So the news organization asks its viewers to participate online. Okay, so if they're asking online, maybe they're sending something out. How are they getting that back? They're getting that back by self-selection, right? Or self-selected, that's what we're officially calling this. Because think about, any survey you've had for school that's been sent to your school email for the whole building. If you answered it yourself. This is just like that. Now, that is a biased way to ask questions. And why, you might be wondering, well, why is that? Well, people who go online to fill out surveys are more likely to have strong opinions, one way or another. Think about those like Yelp opinions, right? For restaurants, or those people who put in responses on Amazon. those are the kinds of people who typically, not always, but very often, they have either a very one-sided view, either very positive or very negative, very for or very against. So when you ask people that are naturally inclined to do that, there's going to be some bias in your response. It's very possible they're going to be skewed in one direction. Second example, we have a computer science teacher wants to know how students at a school use the internet, so that teacher asks students in one of their computer science classes. Well, what is that? Well, that's an example of straight up convenience. Okay? You know, I want to know how students use the internet, so I'm just going to ask my students. All right? So what's wrong with that? Well, that class doesn't represent the entire high school. So only a small portion of the population was included. And more importantly, it wasn't just that they were included, was given the chance to be included. And that's the thing, you have to make sure every part of the population is represented. So if you do it out of convenience, it's unlikely that the population you're talking to or surveying is going to represent the entire building or whatever population you're talking about. So let's switch gears for a moment and talk about a visual issue and bias. So I want you to look at this graph. I'm just going to tell you what this is. This is the percentage of trucks sold over 10 years, the last 10 years, that are still on the road. Okay, so I want you to think about this. Who do you think made this particular graphic? Hopefully in your head, you're saying whichever one has the tallest bar, which would be Chevy, right? It's trying to say that more than 98% of all Chevy trucks sold in the last 10 years are still on the road. They're trying to say, hey, our trucks last the longest, right? No other truck is that dependable, foreign or domestic. That's what it says in there. That's a very compelling visual. I want to show you something. So that's the graphic I just showed you. I want to show you what's wrong with this. This on the left is just taking the truck out of the background. On the right, this is what that graph should actually look like. I don't know if you noticed at first. It's okay if you didn't. The scale. This graph zoomed in so much, it was only showing you 95. It was only showing you up here, 95 to 100%. Yeah, there's a really big difference between distances when you go up by such a small percentage. If you look at that graph on the right, it looks like they are all doing really well. Chevy is doing the best, but barely the best. So I want you to understand that bias doesn't just come in sampling. Bias can come in after the fact in visual representations. Why would Chevy scale their graph like that, the way that it is on the left? Well, because it's to their advantage, right? To show this distance. Wow, we are way better than Ford, and we are this much better than Toyota. No, they're not. They're this much. They're a little bit. So I would draw this more accurate depiction on the right-hand side for you, just to give you some perspective. Okay, so keep that in mind. We want you to be good consumers of information. So don't take a visual that you're given at first glance. Look at the scale, look at the other pieces of information, because the end result is always going to tell their story. That doesn't always make it the true story. Okay, we've still got some other things to talk about. Now, I know you've already got this all written down as long as you printed out your notes. So let's just talk about these key methods of data collection. Okay, so an experiment, that's something that poses a treatment on a group of individuals, okay? Very often, that experiment will have a control and a test group, or maybe multiple control and test groups, okay? So very, very common in a medical scenario. You know, you give one group the placebo, you give one group the real drug, you see how significant the difference is. An observational study This is when somebody goes out and they observe behaviors or interactions, and it's typically used when what you're trying to study is difficult to control or isolate. Okay, so an observational study is what happens when somebody measures variables and you don't control who's part of the study. The survey is another method of data collection where you usually investigate characteristics of a population, okay? And in the survey, every member of the sample is asked one or more questions, and they're asked the same questions. And then last but not least, we have a simulation, which I always like to think of as like a controlled observational study, because you try to reproduce conditions of the real world to match real world outcomes, but it allows you to do things that might previously be impractical or dangerous to actually try and simulate or watch in real life. So the question I have for you to think about for a second is, what types of studies do you think you've maybe participated in? Have you participated in any data collection methods? I want you to think about that for a second. All right, I hope you've taken a moment to think about this. I would like to point out that you have definitely participated in a survey. Think about all the times in Algebra 2 that we ask how you're doing, or for feedback. Anytime a teacher asks you for some feedback on how you're doing in the classroom or how they're doing, that's a survey. You probably wouldn't know if you were part of an observational study. The participant may not know. So you could have been part of an observational study, but you don't know. I think if you were part of an experiment, you would know, and that's very specific. And same thing with a simulation. But I can tell you for sure, of these data collection methods, the one you will probably encounter the most in your life, just naturally, is a survey. Okay, let's see if we can figure out how some data collection happened in these two scenarios. So a researcher records whether people at a gas station use hand sanitizer. So just somebody records whether people use hand sanitizer. That would be an observational study, okay? Because somebody's just watching what happens. A landscaper fertilizes 20 lawns with regular fertilizer and 20 lawns with a new fertilizer. The landscaper then compares the lawns after 10 weeks. Okay, we've got an experiment right here, because you've got like two groups, right? You got kind of your control, your old fertilizer, and 20 with your new fertilizer. So that's definitely an experiment. Now, there is one last topic to talk about today, and I appreciate you bearing with me, and that is recognizing bias in survey questions. Now, I've only got about a minute left, but this is probably the most important because, as I said, surveys are what you are going to encounter the most in your life. Okay, so the wording of questions is important because you want to avoid biased results. Questions that are flawed in a way that leads to inaccurate results are called biased questions. And we want you to avoid and be able to recognize those biased questions. So here's what you want to pay attention to. You want to avoid the following. You want to avoid asking more than one thing. So you want to avoid asking more than one topic in your question. You want to avoid sensitive topics that it might be hard to address too truthfully, especially if you think about who is asking the questions. You want to avoid encouraging responses. It's kind of like when you're leading the witness. And you want to avoid being vague. Okay, if you don't give enough information, it's hard to answer. All right, more on this to come. Thank you so much. Bye.